Hello there ladies, gentlemen and all variations thereupon. Today I'm going to share with you the one simple trick that you can do to improve all of your DIY and craft projects. But before I get onto that, I'm going to go into a long rant where I thank people and say how grateful I am, just to try and get you watching for longer, just so that the watch time increases. I'm kidding, it's scrap paper. Now, when I say scrap paper and I show what I do with it, you're going to think this is bloody obvious, why am I even bothering watching a video about this? But it's one of those things that are so obvious, a lot of people miss out and they don't realise what a big difference it can make. For example, this is a bag that I'm just designing. Not a standard bag in the sense that it has a rounded shape to it, so it goes around the body rather than sitting flush against it. The first thing I can do is draw out the size of the fabric that I've got with one of these little boxes equaling 2 centimetres. So that there's a ratio between the size of the fabric and the size that I've got, and then I just plan out the rest of the build accordingly. And I can see from how I've drawn everything on that I'm going to have loads of excess material based on what I've got. And because it's all on graph paper, I can make sure all lines that are supposed to be parallel are in fact parallel. And what that means is that all the angles of the things I draw, especially around this curve, are going to be accurate not only to any time I reproduce that shape, as here I've got the leather version, here we have this version that's cut out of fabric, which is going to be the top, and this is the design of the top of fabric with the zips included. So every time I've drawn them, I know that these are the same. Within reason, there is a slight variation between them, naturally anyway, based on the build that I'm creating, but I can keep them all same in terms of the size, but also the angle of that. And then once I scale it up, I know these angles are going to be the same. So if you were to go back to my video that I made of creating the cloak, I didn't use graph paper when I was planning that out, and I spent a lot of time concerning myself with how I was going to fit everything onto the fabric. I know I could get the cloak on, but then also the hood, how was I going to fit that in? If I'd used graph paper, I would have been able to plan that out before I'd even laid out the fabric, so it would have saved me a lot of time. But it doesn't just apply to sewing and leatherworking projects. You can also use it for things like woodwork, because the angles are always going to be the same between the plan that you draw and what's actually going to be in the real world, because you're making sure all the lines are parallel, that are supposed to be parallel and relative in size. That means when you plan everything out on the graph paper and then you go to actually make the cuts in the real world, providing your cuts are accurate, you can make sure that everything's going to fit together perfectly, so there's not going to be any gaps between things that join not necessarily at a right angle, that all your joints are going to fit perfectly. And if you were going to use it for woodworking, you could always, provided you were drawing it on a 1-to-1 scale, you could draw out the joint that you wanted to make, cut it out, attach it to the wood, and then cut out around what you've already drawn, and then you know everything will fit perfectly because you've already had all the measurements out on here. It's a lot more accurate than if you're using a ruler to measure it out. Rulers, you know, there's a bit more wiggle room in them than if you use graph paper. Unfortunately, as I found out, graph paper is becoming harder and harder to actually buy because people are using spreadsheets on computers. So if you get some, they're like gold dust. In fact, this particular graph, 80 leaves of graph paper from Woolworths, a store that closed in the early 2000s, and it's even older than that. As you can see, in my childhood, I designed my future house that has a lab 1 and a lab 2 underneath, because clearly I'd drawn this after watching Dexter's Laboratory and decided that if I have a sibling that's going to destroy my lab, then I need a secret lab underneath that lab. So to sum up, it's a very obvious thing that you could just use graph paper to create scale models of everything that you want to create, and it makes it a lot easier to plan out in advance. At 90% of any craft is the planning phase before you actually cut anything. But trust me, it makes a huge difference. And if you've never done it before, just give it a try and see how much easier it makes your projects, knowing that you've got everything planned out and you know where it's going to cut and you know the angles. In fact, since I've started doing that before each of my projects, the only time I've ever had to redo a cut was when there was a problem with the material. Every other time when I've planned it out like that and then I've transferred it across and done the cut, the pieces fit together perfectly. I minimise my wastage. So that's my number one tip on how you can improve your projects very easily. And until next time, I'll catch you later.